This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. The rapid spread of the coronavirus disease, which the World Health Organization has declared a global pandemic, has big implications for K-12 and higher education in the United States. Education journalists around the country are playing an important role in helping communities understand the situation, from school closures to colleges shifting classes entirely online, and how to make sure high-need students maintain access to wraparound services like healthcare and meals. Joining us today are two education journalists who are deeply immersed in this story. They're helping to steer their news organization's coverage of the crisis. Lesli Maxwell is Assistant Managing Editor at Education Week. Lesli, thank you for being here.
Glad to be here, Emily.
And Karin Fischer is a senior reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education. Karin, welcome to you as well.
Thanks.
Lesli, I want to start with you. You've been a journalist for a long time. When did you start to realize that this situation was really new territory?
That's a really interesting question that I was thinking about 2 days ago. In fact, I went back just in our own archive from the last couple months to see when we published our first piece about coronavirus. We did what amounted to a very short blog post on January 29th. And Ariana Prothero, who covers student well-being and health issues for us, really struggled at that point in time to find people in schools who were even thinking about the virus. The framing of that piece was coronavirus is getting worse in China. What are schools in the US? How are they preparing to respond? And even organizations that are focused on school health, like the School Nurses Association, didn't have a whole lot to offer at that point. Well, here we are less than 2 months from that point in time, and we're seeing mass shutdowns of schools, scrambling of resources and educators to put together some kind of learning programs for kids who are going to be out of school, how to continue meal service. It's just breathtaking.
With the obvious caveat that things are changing quickly, and we are recording this episode on Friday, March 13th, what do we know right now about the number of schools that have been closed and the number of the K-12 students that are impacted by that?
So as of 11 a.m. Eastern Time on March 13th, at least 18,700 K-12 schools have been closed or are scheduled to close, affecting at least 8.1 million students. And 8.1 million students is about 16% of the U.S. population of K-12 school children.
There's been a lot of examples of strong leadership by school district superintendents, school boards, and even educators themselves, sort of coming together to try to figure out what to do next as individual communities, and then even share that information with each other when we do feel like there's been something of an information vacuum more at the national level. What's your take on that?
Well, I think that's true. I think while it was maybe a little slow to get started in that late January to early February timeframe, I think the messaging coming from the federal level was a little mixed and confusing. So superintendents and state officials decided to charge ahead on their own to make plans for how to respond. We've seen in some really large districts that have a lot of experience with emergencies, a lot of those being weather-related. Hurricanes come to mind. Some of the big Florida districts, they have very robust emergency operations plans, and those plans have steps in them that address pandemic. Those are the kinds of districts that are more able to stand up meal services and response plans. But I think the average school district in the United States, which enrolls, somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 kids, while they may have an emergency plan, many don't have specific steps to follow for the spread of disease or pandemic. And while there had been cases in the recent past of like H1N1, those were far more isolated. I just think the scale of this thing and the fast-moving nature of it has been a real challenge.
A lot of reporters look to Education Week for sources and for help, and also for some national context. And one of the pages that's been important for you and for those reporters out there and for the public in general is a map showing some of the school closures. How are you gathering that information? What are you doing to sort of reach out to districts and to ask them to share what they know?
Well, this has been a gargantuan piece of labor for us, but really, really important. And just like everything else with this story, it started off rather small and felt manageable until it didn't. We published the map late last week, Friday, so a week ago today. And at that point, if memory serves, we had upwards of, maybe 50 school closures, and some of those were entire districts, but small ones, with the exception of one Washington State district. But we have been relying on local media reports, school and district announcements, and frankly, our audience and readers letting us know. And we have a dedicated team of 3 people, our 2 research librarians and one of our web producers who've been managing all of this. But as the wave of closures has exponentially increased, we've had to enlist reporters, interns, lots of people to help us manage this. And even still, we cannot update in real time. There's a lot of manual labor involved in doing this. And it's shifting now that we're seeing whole states close their schools down. We're tracking districts and individual schools to entire states. So we're having to shift our tactics and methodology a little bit too as the situation on the ground changes.
Well, clearly, what's happening right now is a far cry from a district saying, if we know there's a snow day in the forecast, we're going to send iPads home with the kids so they can keep up with their reading assignments, or maybe teachers doing a flipped classroom experiment on a limited basis. What we have right now are entire districts saying that students will be learning online perhaps for weeks or even longer than that. In some ways, it's an unwelcome, but still, I would argue, kind of fascinating natural experiment for digital learning. What are you seeing so far in terms of these trends?
Well, I'm going to share a little news with you. We did a nationally representative survey just on Monday of this week, so 4 days ago, of superintendents and other senior level district leaders. There were a few school principals that got picked up in the survey to ask the question, if your school or district has a prolonged closure, what is your capability for providing meaningful learning remotely? 41% of the respondents said they could not provide meaningful remote learning to every child at all. 41%. That number was even higher when we dug a little deeper into the data for extremely high poverty districts. A much smaller percentage said they could do a day or two, so more of the snow day scenario. But I think what we're really looking at realistically is that most districts are not going to be able to do meaningful remote learning for a prolonged period.
So, if I'm an education reporter, what's the question I should be asking my district's technology officer?
I would be asking to see detailed plans about what they're offering. Most education reporters in covering districts probably already know if those are districts that have one-to-one, in other words, districts that provide devices to kids. But even with the device, what is the ready availability of internet access in a lot of communities? And I would be asking to see what those lesson plans are. We have seen districts, Seattle Public Schools, a couple of hours before they announced they were closing, they announced that they were not going to try to stand up a remote learning program for their district because of the high numbers of kids that don't have devices and access to the internet. They were going to be putting together good old-fashioned paper instructional packets to send home. So I would really be interrogating those things with my districts if I was at a local level. The equity piece of this is really important, but there's also just the reality piece. I mean, even in households that have parents who are equipped to sit down with kids and try to ensure that they're doing some digital learning, like how realistic is that if they're having to work from home? I just think the disruption cannot be underestimated.
Beyond the lost learning time, what are teachers worried about right now for their students and potentially also for themselves?
Well, I think for schools that aren't closed down yet, teachers are really seeing high levels of anxiety in kids. Kids are asking a lot of questions about the virus. They're hearing and picking up on lots of things that are inaccurate or downright wrong. And so they're probably having to combat against that as best they can. They might be worried about their own health. So far, it seems that younger people and children are not as likely to get sick, but they can be carriers of the virus. So those are things that I think are top of mind to teachers. We've done a couple pieces to help teachers think about how they can talk to their kids about the virus. And also, if they're still in school, some ideas for planning lessons around the virus that keep the learning going, but that also really feed the facts to kids to help them kind of address the anxiety when they know kind of what the science is behind it, what people understand right now.
We know and we've known for a long time that there are shortages in K-12 schools of two critical personnel roles that seems like really are of use right now in this crisis response. One are school counselors, and the second are school nurses. What are you seeing nationally?
Well, we just did a story about nurses, and I know the ratio for nurses to students is even worse than it is counselor to students. So the data I don't have off the top of my head, but there about a quarter of US public schools don't have a nurse at all. Some have a part-time nurse, and then maybe around 35 to 40% do have a full-time nurse. Nurses are and should be critical partners to their principals and, frankly, to their senior level district leaders. I mean, they are health professionals. They can be a crucial part of your communications team as you're talking with your staff, with your students, with your families about the virus. Of course, they're on the front lines of talking with students and staff about all of the tactics to minimize the spread, with modeling good hand washing to working with their school leaders on some social distancing, maybe changing up the way you're doing lunch, not doing assemblies, those kinds of things. And they really ought to be leveraged to be liaisons to your local public health officials, because they can understand better than anybody what public health officials are saying and translate that for their administrators and for the broader school community.
So I think certainly an angle for local reporters would be to check on those nursing ratios and find out what districts are doing to try to fill those gaps, even temporarily, whether it's with public-private partnerships or help from nonprofits.
I agree. And they should also be asking their districts, do you have a health professional who is part of your emergency response team, and what role are they playing in that?
We're talking with education journalist Lesli Maxwell of Education Week and Karin Fischer of the Chronicle of Higher Education about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on students and schools. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And if you're looking for more information about coronavirus coverage, please go to our new topics page at ewa.org. Karin Fischer, I want to turn to you and shift now to the higher ed perspective here. What do we know so far about how many colleges and universities have sent students home and have either ended the semester early or gone to online classes?
To be honest, Emily, we don't have a firm number because it's happened so quickly that it became almost overwhelming to count. I think at the last count we had more than 200 colleges in some way curtailing classes, going online. Some of them have kept their campuses open and are allowing students to stay. Some have sent their students home. Some are saying it's temporary. And some have said, this is it. This is the end of the semester, and you're going to be doing the rest of this remotely. It's such an incredibly fast-moving thing. At one point, our online editor was trying to track them all and tweet them out. And at a certain point, it just became so many colleges sending out so many notices of their decisions that it became almost impossible to keep track.
You heard Lesli say a few moments ago that they had done a survey of K-12, and about 40% of superintendents and school leaders said they were not prepared to provide a meaningful online learning experience. Do you have any sense of what that percentage might be at higher ed?
I can't put a number on it, but I do think that there is real variability in the preparedness of institutions as a whole, but also individual faculty members to just turn immediately to going online. I mean, yes, we've seen over the years many more hybrid courses, and so many more professors have become used to teaching in an online environment. And certainly, we're now seeing students who themselves grew up as kind of digital natives, and so are used to learning and just living in an online environment. But I think that the notion that suddenly people will just be able to turn a key and put a class that was very much designed for in real life classroom space and put it online, it's going to be challenging. I think the good news about it is that there are people out there who have a lot of expertise. And I think one of the real hallmarks of the response to the pandemic is just the amount of sharing. And so I think a lot of people who do have more experience, whether it is being on sort of long-time online instructors or colleges such as NYU and Duke, which have campuses in China that they had to close in January, and so had to pivot to online learning much earlier than other institutions. I think they've all been really, really good about sharing, okay, here are challenges you're going to find, here are best practices. But I mean, it's still, there's going to be some courses that are going to be much more difficult to deliver in the online space, in the sciences and the arts, for example.
If I'm a higher education reporter and I'm talking now to the technology officers at my local college or university, how do I sort of suss out whether the kind of program that they're going to provide for students is going to be meaningful?
I mean, I would ask very much about the kind of guidance that they're giving and the support. I think some of these very early pivots online, understandably, because they had to happen so fast, it was left up a bit to the individual professors. How are you going to do remote learning? And in some cases, such as the University of Washington, they had less than a week left of class. And so it wasn't a really critical thing. But I would really ask, what kinds of resources are you providing? What sort of training are you doing? And I would also, as Lesli pointed out, be asking them, who are your students and what kinds of technology are they going to have access to? If you are talking about low-income students, they might not have a computer at home. They might not have reliable broadband. Are you able to be delivering your courses with the understanding that students might be accessing them on their cell phones because that's the only kind of device that they have? And so I'd really want to know how much they're thinking through this and how they're talking with the faculty and instructional designers. I mean, institutions that have a lot of experience in online course delivery, like Arizona State University, for example, have instructional designers who work with faculty members who might not be experts in online learning to help them kind of pivot and think about the things that have to, by necessity, be different in an online environment. And so I think it's really going to be a big question about what sorts of supports institutions are going to be providing to their individual faculty.
And then I also do want to talk about those low-income students, especially kids who may be first generation, and this may be very new to them, especially in this kind of crisis. Beyond this sort of immediate issue of how are they going to get home or where are they going to stay or what are they going to do for meals, what are some of the other challenges here for them that might persist a little bit more long-term?
I mean, I think there's just so many unknowns for these students. You're right in hitting on the immediate questions. I did a story the other day and I talked with the student who was petitioning his college to be able to be one of the few students who could stay behind on campus because not only was being on campus going to be a source of food and a roof over his head, and it was also when he went home, he was really worried about how am I going to take an online class when I'm living in a small home with half a dozen other people. For a lot of these students, they are very reliant and not just for themselves, but perhaps as part of the income for their families by the jobs that they have on campus. Some colleges have said that they will continue to pay students for their on-campus jobs even when they're gone and disperse back home. But I think that's something that students are very concerned about. And I think one of the real long-term questions is, we know that vulnerable students, low-income students, first-generation students, non-traditional students, working parents, they're very susceptible to having just the slightest bump in the road be something that derails their educational experience. They can't get adequate childcare, and so suddenly they miss a couple of classes and they fall behind in their coursework and they drop out. This is a global pandemic. And so I think it's going to be a real question about what's going to happen with some of these most vulnerable populations, not just in the short term, not just this semester, but into the next year.
Do you have any kind of ballpark yet on what the economic impact of this crisis is going to be to higher education more broadly?
I think it's really hard to put an exact number on it. In the short term, while certainly colleges are really incurring some costs and they're worried about the expenses, I think in the short term, it's going to be something that they can handle because they have, as my colleague Lee Gardner reported today in a really terrific article, they have rainy day funds. And so I think into the spring semester, they will have to draw on those reserves potentially, but they will be okay. The real question, I think, is the potential long-term one, especially if this starts to hurt enrollments, if they have to incur a lot of costs to pivot to online education in a long-term way. If this lasts into the fall, we know that there are already quite a number of colleges in the US that their financial position already was, if not precarious, certainly weakened. And so I think that it is a real question about what the long-term impacts is going to be on some of those most vulnerable institutions, because, we were talking before about vulnerable people, but there are also real variabilities in institutions and their ability to sustain the kind of hit that a long-term event like the coronavirus could be.
Is there somewhere that you can point to where higher ed is getting it right, or maybe someone's taken a positive leadership role here?
I think a couple of things. One is I do think that higher ed, perhaps more than most other institutions in the country, had a little bit of a head start in thinking about this. If you think about the universities and higher education's response to this versus SARS, a couple of decades ago, I think there's been learning from that, and they're just so much more globally interconnected that they had to begin thinking about these things earlier. That said, they were thinking about it much more in the context of students and faculty and relationships with China. But even in January, I was talking with people who were already beginning to activate campus-wide planning and thinking about what would happen if there was a threat on campus and coronavirus really came home, so to speak. That said, at that time, when people talked to me about campus closures, that was mentioned as kind of the extreme. And I remember my editor saying, really, is this what's going to happen? And now we're in a period where, 200 colleges have announced closures in the last week alone. So I think that although perhaps they had a head start, that still, as Leslie's pointing out, things have evolved so quickly that it's really been tough to keep abreast of all the evolution. One other thing I would say is there are some colleges that have been really thoughtful about how to proactively address the needs of low-income students. I would single out, for example, Berea College in Kentucky. The average income there is below $30,000. Nearly all their students are in Pell Grants. And so all of their students were maybe in what might be the minority on other campuses, in the majority on their institutions. But they did things like say, look, we know that not everyone's going to have access to internet. So we're going to figure out ways right now to wrap up instruction and not make students dependent on having to sit in Starbucks so that they can continue their studies. And they also pledged to continue to pay students for their online work through the end of the semester, knowing that for many of them it was a critical source of family income.
Well, while acknowledging, of course, that the health and safety of students should be paramount, this is causing a lot of complications for colleges for things like recruiting visits for next year's graduate students or for faculty positions they're trying to fill, where we can no longer bring in candidates in person. And I'm curious also, though, how it's going to affect things like graduate school entrance exams, like the GRE and the MCAT and the LSAT.
I think all of these things are so fluid. The SAT, in fact, there's a major sitting of the SAT is tomorrow on Saturday. We're recording on Friday. And there's been a wave of cancellations of that. There's been less clear guidance, say, about the GRE, but we saw how it was handled as the pandemic spread overseas in China and South Korea, and those standardized tests were all canceled. I would expect those to follow. In terms of admissions, I do think admissions officers have been scrambling. Again, it's something where they were already concerned and thinking about it in the global sense. And so I think they began to think about how can we reach out to students electronically. If they can't come and do campus visits, this would be admitted students. We're right in the heart of the admission season right now. How can we still give them a taste of campus if they're not going to be able to do that campus visit to make up their mind? I think they're spending a lot more time on electronic outreach that they might not have done otherwise. But if this continues further into the semester or even into the fall, that's going to be a whole matter entirely. Right now, we've got a travel advisory for much of the world. There's a whole population of students, international students, who might not even be able to come to the United States to start their studies. And we've become that much more international, and that will be a big impact on enrollments and, frankly, on college budgets.
On the testing question, Lesli, let me turn back to you. Is there going to be an asterisk now on test results for high stakes tests or things that are used for statewide accountability report cards under the Every Student Succeeds Act? I know it's still early days, but are those the kinds of conversations and things that education reporters should be thinking about for maybe longer term stories?
Absolutely. And we're in the throes of reporting that out right now. Washington State yesterday announced that they would not conduct state assessments this spring because of the disruption to schooling. And I think we can expect to see more of that. I think the learning loss is a real issue, and states are going to be looking to the federal government to get some relief from some of those accountability measures. I think when kids are not in school, they're not learning. You can't conduct valid mass testing. So the asterisk, I'm sure, is what we can expect.
I have a question for both of you, and I want to tell you again how much I appreciate you making time for EWA Radio during what has to be just an incredibly hectic period for you at work. But what are some ways that education reporters can help to contribute to responsible coverage of this crisis? Karin, what are your suggestions?
I think one of the things goes to something we've both been talking about, which is really to get at the ways in which colleges and K through 12 institutions as well are responding to the needs of the most vulnerable of the people on their campuses. And that means students, but it also means faculty and staff. And I think one of the things that we're really talking about is, what is this meaning for contingent staff, contingent instructors, adjuncts? What does it mean for the people on campus who serve the meals and work in the residence halls and clean, who are working double time really to clean campuses right now and make sure that they're continuing to be, safe as possible. And so I think it's really important to look at this through an equity lens and think about how institutions can respond. Beyond that, I think there's a real tension here, as there is in any sort of important story, between wanting to give as definitive an answer as possible to some of these questions. Like, what is this going to mean for testing? What will this mean for graduating seniors who might not be able to really finish their coursework in the appropriate way? I think we need to be as thoughtful and to raise the issues and shine a light on them. I think we also can't get too far out ahead and say, well, this is definitely what's going to happen and this is going to be the repercussions, because there's so many unknowns and things are happening so quickly that I think we do need to be a little bit measured in how we think about these effects long term.
Lesli, what about you? What are some tips for local reporters who may have been thrust into this?
Well, I think the phase of the story now for many of them is schools are, if they're not shut down already, we can probably expect that more will be. And I would suggest looking at, back to Kara's good point on vulnerable kids, looking at the data in the districts that you cover, the percentages of kids who rely on free and reduced lunch, what the special education enrollments are, and really be talking with your local districts about what, if any, services they're going to be able to continue to provide if there's a prolonged closure. I mean, what we're seeing now is 2-week closure, 3-week closure. That could change, and then that becomes a bigger lift and a bigger dilemma for schools and districts to keep those kinds of services going. I think staying on top of that is really, really important. Longer term, I think asking leaders now what they're thinking about in terms of addressing the lost learning time. Is that going to be extending the school year? What are some of the things that they're already starting to think about when it comes to that? I also think for local reporters, and this could extend beyond their education journalists to maybe their business teams, looking at what the economic impacts of shutting down schools for a prolonged period may have in those communities. There are a lot of different angles to pursue that way. And then one other idea might be longer term, once things start to settle down, is how districts and schools change how they plan for emergencies, like how much the coronavirus alters that piece of work that districts need to be mindful of would be something to stay on top of.
Lesli Maxwell is Assistant Managing Editor of Education Week, and Karin Fischer is a Senior Reporter at the Chronicle of Higher Education. Lesli and Karin, thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emily.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to know more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a good week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.